Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive.
Glad to be here.
Get ready to jump into, well, a 1,000-year stretch of history that really reshaped the spiritual landscape of India.
Yeah, we're talking roughly 8th to 18th century.
A time just bursting with new ways to think about and connect with the divine.
It's a truly dynamic era, a real mosaic of beliefs and practices that, as the source material shows, were constantly interacting, constantly evolving.
And we've got quite the stack of sources to dig into.
We do. Texts, poems, architectural details, images even. They let us peek into this really vibrant past.
So our mission today?
To pull out the key insights, really understand how these traditions, often called Bhakti and Sufi, came about and, well, why they still resonate.
Consider this your shortcut, maybe, to understanding a millennium of pretty intense religious and social change.
We'll look at everything. Devotional poets singing their hearts out, mystical saints looking for deeper truths.
And how all of this played out against, the backdrop of society and power.
Okay, let's dive in then.
Where do we start?
Well, to get a handle on the religious world back then, our sources grew up a really useful idea. Great and little traditions.
Ah, yes. The sociologist Robert Redfield's concept, right?
Exactly. It helps historians sort of make sense of the landscape.
Okay. So my understanding is great tradition refers to the more dominant, maybe widespread practices associated with elites, perhaps.
Sort of, yeah, or priestly groups. And the little traditions, those are more the local, community-specific customs, think villages, specific groups, that kind of thing.
Right, local rituals.
But here's the crucial bit the sources really highlight. These weren't, separate boxes. They weren't static. They were constantly influencing each other. Scholars even put quotes around great and little sometimes.
Why is that?
To show it wasn't necessarily a strict hierarchy. This interaction, this sort of back and forth, it's fundamental to understanding the religious shifts happening then.
So not just top-down influence?
No, definitely not. Change was bubbling up from below, spreading sideways too.
And speaking of bubbling up, the sources show this, explosion in the visibility of gods and goddesses, a huge range of them.
Absolutely. You see it everywhere. Sculpture, texts, local practices. And the sources seem to identify two main processes driving this.
Okay, what's the first one?
Well, one is this effort to kind of spread Brahmanical ideas more widely.
How so?
A key example is the Puranic texts. These ancient stories, mythologies, they were compiled and simplified into basic Sanskrit verse.
To make them easier to understand.
Exactly. To make them accessible to women and Shudras groups traditionally kept out of Vedic study.
Right. So opening up parts of that great tradition was the other big process.
The flip side, really. Brahmanas themselves actively embracing, reworking beliefs and practices from the little traditions.
So they weren't just imposing their ideas.
No, they were adopting, integrating, taking local customs, local deities, and fitting them into the broader Sanskritic framework. It was a constant dialogue.
Can you give us a concrete example? How did this work with a specific deity?
Yeah, the sources point to a really fascinating case in Puri in Orissa. By the 12th century, you have this local deity, traditionally represented by a wooden image, made by tribal specialists, actually, and it gets identified as Jagannatha, who is seen as a form of Vishnu.
Wow.
And what's really striking, as the images show, is how different this wooden figure looks compared to, typical Vishnu statues elsewhere.
So the visual representation itself shows the blend.
It's a perfect example. A powerful local tradition integrated into a major Sanskritic deity's identity.
And this happened with goddesses, too.
Yeah, similar processes. You find local deities, sometimes just simple stones, being brought into the Puranic system, often identified as wives of the major male gods, Parvati, Lakshmi, that sort of thing.
It sounds like this incredible synthesis was happening.
Yeah.
But the sources also say it wasn't all peaceful integration, did they?
Definitely not. There were real differences, even conflicts.
Like what?
Well, the sources mention things like tantrism, which was actually quite widespread. Yeah, tantric rituals were often open to everyone, men, women, all castes, and sometimes they explicitly ignored the authority of the Vedas. They influenced Shaivism, Buddhism, especially in certain areas.
That sounds like a direct challenge to the more, let's say, orthodox Vedic path.
It was. And you see shifts even within the Sanskritic world itself. The main Vedic gods, Agni, Indra, Soma, they become pretty marginal in the Puranic traditions.
While others rose.
Exactly. Vishnu, Shiva, the goddess, they become much more prominent. So even though the Vedas were still respected in theory, a lot of lived practice had moved way beyond them.
Leading to tension.
For sure, between groups prioritizing Vedic tradition and those following other paths, and also, tensions with Buddhism or Jainism still existed.
And yet somehow, over centuries, all this diversity, these sometimes clashing practices, they all kind of ended up under the umbrella term Hindu.
Yeah, that's a whole complex historical process the sources trace. This huge range of beliefs, practices, often very local, gradually got identified by outsiders, and eventually by many insiders too, as part of this broader religious identity.
Okay, and it's in this, vibrant and maybe messy landscape that devotional worship, Bhakti, really comes to the forefront.
Exactly. Bhakti wasn't new, it had deep roots, but during this period it just exploded in popularity, often centered around these amazing poet saints.
Where did the sources point for the earliest big movements?
Down south in Tamil Nadu, starting maybe around the 6th century, we see the Elvars.
Devotees of Vishnu.
Right. Immersed in love for Vishnu. And the Nayanars, the leaders, devoted to Shiva. And these weren't, stuffy theologians. They were poets, traveling around, pouring out their devotion in incredible hymns sung in Tamil.
And these hymns weren't just private expressions. They had a public impact.
Oh, massive. As these saints traveled, they'd identify specific places as sacred, as homes for their deities.
And those places became
major temples later on. Big pilgrimage centers. And the hymns themselves, they got woven into temple rituals. Even images of the saints became objects of worship.
Wow. So it's personal devotion fueling public religious life.
Yeah.
Did these movements challenge the social order? Especially caste?
The sources strongly suggest they did, or at least they opened up new ways of thinking about it. A really key point is that devotees came from everywhere. All sorts of backgrounds.
Including lower castes.
Including those considered untouchable. And that was a direct challenge to the Brahmanical hierarchy.
Do the sources give specific examples of this attitude?
Absolutely. Take Elvar Tondar devotee. He was a Brahmana himself.
Okay.
But in source 1, he basically says Vishnu prefers his devoted servants, even if they're from the lowest caste, over Brahmanas who just know the Vedas but lack that love.
That's pretty direct.
And then there's the Nayanar Par in source 2. He questions the whole point of law books, lineage, family status, saying the only real refuge is bowing to Shiva. It's a critique of social structures based on birth, favoring inner devotion instead.
Those are powerful statements for that time. What about women in these early Bhakti movements?
Another really striking thing the sources highlight. You have major women figures. Andal, for instance, an Elvar woman.
Her poems are still sung, right?
Widely. Expressing this intense love for Vishnu, like a bride longing for him. And then there's Karikala Mayar, a Nayanar, a devotee of Shiva, who followed this path of extreme asceticism.
And her description of herself in Source 3, it's unforgettable.
It really is. She calls herself a female Pei, a demoness.
Yeah.
Describes herself with bulging veins, protruding eyes, totally rejecting conventional ideas of female beauty.
Why do that?
It shows how these women renounce social norms, social obligations to follow their devotional path, often outside traditional orders, too, a real challenge to patriarchy.
So popular movements attracting diverse people, challenging norms. How did the rulers react?
Well, rulers were definitely paying attention and often engaged strategically. Remember, different religious traditions were kind of competing for royal support back then.
Buddhism, Jainism, these Bhakti paths.
Exactly. And the powerful Chola rulers in the south, say from the 9th to 13th centuries, they actively backed Brahmanical and Bhakti traditions.
How do they show that support?
Well, they built these magnificent temples for Vishnu and Shiva. Think of the famous ones at Chidambaram, Thanjavur, often inspired by the visions of the Nayanar saints.
Like the Nataraja bronzes.
That's thought to be influenced by these ideas, yeah. They were literally casting devotion in bronze and stone.
And they connected with the saints more directly, too.
Oh, yeah. This was key for claiming divine support, asserting their own authority, especially since the saints were popular with important groups, like the Vela peasants.
So what did the kings do?
The Cholas sponsored the collection and singing of the Tamil Shiva hymns, the Tevaram, in the temples. They even had metal images made of the saints themselves apar, Sambandar, Sundar, and carried them in processions.
So religion and politics, very intertwined.
Very practically intertwined, popular devotion bolstering royal legitimacy.
Okay, moving ahead chronologically. 12th century. The sources bring us to Karnataka and another major movement.
Right, the Virashaiva tradition, led by a figure named Basavana. His followers are called Virashaivas, or Lingayats.
Lingayats, okay.
Yeah.
What were their core beliefs?
Intense focus on Shiva, represented by a small linga that male devotees often wore, and a really crucial belief: union with Shiva after death. No rebirth.
No rebirth. That's a big departure.
Huge. And it led to practices like ceremonial burial instead of cremation, which went directly against the rules in the Dharmashastras.
So another movement challenging the establishment.
A very strong challenge. They flat out rejected the caste system, the whole idea of ritual pollution tied to caste, and as we said, rebirth.
Which must have appealed to marginalized groups?
Naturally.
Yeah.
And they also pushed for social changes that went against the grain of the Dharmashastras, things like post-puberty marriage, widow remarriage.
And we know this from
their sayings, their vachanas, composed in the Kannada language.
And Basavana's own vachanas, like the one in Source 4, they pack a punch, criticizing empty ritual.
They really do. He uses these incredibly vivid images, like when they see a serpent carved in stone, they pour milk on it. If a real serpent comes, they say, kill, kill.
Wow, that gets deep.
It totally exposes the hypocrisy, right? Prioritizing the symbol over the real thing, or feeding a stone image while a human servant goes hungry. It's a radical call for genuine compassion, real devotion, over just going through the motions.
So while all this is happening within what we now broadly call Hinduism, another massive influence is arriving Islamic traditions.
Yes. Now, context started way earlier, 7th century, traders, travelers, but the big shift comes with the establishment of rulers who practiced Islam. First the Delhi Sultanate, 13th century, then later the Mughals.
And they brought Islamic law, the Sharia.
In theory, yes. The sources talk about the role of the ulama, the religious scholars, who were supposed to advise rulers based on the Sharia.
But how did that actually work when most of the population wasn't Muslim?
Well, it was complex. The sources explain this concept of zimmi, protected people. Initially, for Jews and Christians under Muslim rule, they paid a tax, the jizya, for protection.
And this was extended to Hindus in India.
It was, so there was a legal framework. But, and this is really important, the sources show that rulers often adopted surprisingly flexible, pragmatic policies.
Meaning they didn't always follow the letter of the law?
Pretty much. Look at Source 5, Emperor Akbar, 1598, explicitly letting Jesuits build a church in combat. Or Source 6, a letter from Aurangzeb, often seen as much stricter,
right,
showing real reverence in 1661-62 for a Hindu jogi, Shiv Marat, sending him gifts. These examples show that, the practicalities of ruling a diverse empire often led to policies way more flexible than strict religious theory might suggest.
That's fascinating. Politics meeting reality. So the spread of Islam wasn't just top-down from rulers. How did it happen among ordinary people?
Through all sorts of ways across different social levels. Of course, core practices like the 5 pillars were adopted, but there's amazing evidence of local adaptation.
Like what?
Like Arab Muslim traders who settled on the Malabar coast in Kerala. They didn't just adopt the local language, Malayalam, but also local customs. Things like matrilineal tracing descent through the mother and matrilineal residence where the husband goes to live with the wife's family.
Wow, that's deep integration.
It really shows culture and faith blending. And you see it physically, too, in architecture.
How so?
Well, mosques everywhere have the mihrab, the prayer niche facing Mecca, and the minbar, the pulpit. Those are universal. But the sources show us pictures, 6.9, 6.0, 6.11, where things like roofs, building materials, they vary hugely.
Reflecting local styles.
Exactly. Local styles, local materials in places as different as Kerala, Bangladesh, Kashmir, a real blend.
It also seems, from the sources, that the labels Hindu and Muslim as these fixed opposing groups, that wasn't always how people thought, especially early on.
That's a really interesting point the sources raise. If you look at texts from, say, the 8th to 14th centuries, they rarely use terms like Musulman or Muslim.
What do they use instead?
They often identify newcomers by where they came from. Turushka for Turks, Tajika for people from Tajikistan, Parashika for Persians. Sometimes they even used older terms for other foreign groups, like Shakas or Yavanas.
And the term Lecha.
Yes. That term often popped up for communities seen as outside the caste system, speaking non-Sanskrit languages. Now, it could be derogatory, sure, but the sources suggest it didn't automatically mean a single Muslim community strictly opposing a single Hindu one. Not in the way we might think of those terms today. Identity was, more fluid.
It sounds incredibly complex. Identity, interaction. And another huge piece of this puzzle with the arrival of Islam is Sufism.
Absolutely crucial. Sufism arose within Islam kind of as a mystical path. often seen as a reaction against the growing worldliness of the early caliphates.
What was their focus?
Intense inner life, love for God, seeking salvation through direct personal experience. Following the Prophet Muhammad's personal example, they were often quite critical of theologians focused only on rules and doctrines.
And this mystical path became more organized over time.
Yeah, by around the 11th century, it starts to institutionalize. You get the khanqa, basically a hospice or spiritual center, led by a master, a sheikh, pir, or murshid.
Who would train disciples.
Exactly. The master trains myriads disciples and appoints successors, khalifas. And a core idea is the silsila, this spiritual chain linking master to disciple going all the way back to the prophet. It was believed to transmit spiritual power, barakat. Initiation rituals were key.
And when a sheikh passed away, their tomb became important.
Hugely important. The dargah, the tomb shrine, became a center for devotion, for pilgrimage that's called ziyarat.
Why visit the tomb?
People go, especially on the saints' death anniversary, the bars, which marks their union with God, to seek the saints' barakat, their spiritual grace, maybe ask for intercession. These saints were seen as walis, friends of God.
Is there an early example of this?
The sources mention Data Ganj Bach in Lahore. His tomb became a revered spot very early on, showing this practice taking root.
And the sources mention some differences among Sufi groups.
Briefly, yeah. You had some called Basharia, often wandering mendicants, maybe ignoring formal rituals or Sharia, sometimes looked down upon by the establishment. Then you had the Basharia Sufis who did follow the Sharia.
And among all these groups, the Chichis became especially influential in India.
That's a major point in the sources, yes. Their success seems largely down to how well they adapted to the local Indian setting, how they integrated elements from existing devotional traditions here.
What was life like inside a Chishti Khanqa? What did the sources say?
They paint a picture of these incredibly vibrant, open, social hubs. Take Sheikh Nizamuddin Aliya's place near Delhi. Disciples might have small cells, but the main hall, the Jama'a Khana, was where everyone lived, prayed, interacted.
How was it supported?
By future, basically, unasked for charity, gifts coming in. They ran a kind of open kitchen, a langar, and people from all walks of life came.
All walks of life.
Seriously. Soldiers, slaves, singers, merchants, rich, poor, Hindu yogis, Qalandars. They'd all flock there morning till night, seeking guidance, healing, the sheikh's blessing. Even famous figures like the poet Amir Khusrau, the historian Ziauddin Barani, they were visitors.
It sounds incredibly open, a real meeting place.
It really was, and they incorporated local customs too, things like bowing before the sheikh, offering water to visitors, shaving the heads of new initiates, even some yogic exercises. This willingness to embrace local ways was key to their wide appeal.
And the dargahs, the tombs of the great Chishti saints, they became huge pilgrimage sites for everyone.
Absolutely. The ziyarat to Khwaja Muinuddin's tomb in Ajmer, he's known as Gharib Nawaz, comforter of the poor. It's been popular for centuries. People of all faiths go.
Rulers too.
Oh, yes. The sources mention Sultan Muhammad bin Tughlaq visited early on, but Emperor Akbar was famously devoted, visited 14 times, sometimes more than once a year, seeking blessings for military campaigns, for sons. He gave huge gifts, a massive cauldron for the langar, built a mosque there.
And it wasn't just men, right? Mughal princesses went too.
Yes. So 7 is this really moving account by Jahanara, Shah Jahan's daughter. She describes her pilgrimage to Ajmer in 1643.
What did she describe?
Her deep reverence, doing extra prayers, being careful not to sleep with her feet towards the tomb, walking barefoot, kissing the ground, walking around the tomb 7 times, placing her scarf on it. It just shows the intense personal devotion people felt across society, across religious lines.
And Source 8 specifically talks about this mixing, this syncretism at another shrine.
It does. It's an 18th century account of Nasiruddin Shiragi, Delhi's shrine. It explicitly says Muslims and Hindus pay visits in the same spirit. They gathered there, sought cures through ritual baths, joined in activities together. Clear evidence of popular piety crossing religious boundaries.
The Chishtis also seem to have used local languages and music really effectively.
Definitely. They spoke Hindavi, the language around Delhi. Sufis like Baba Farid wrote poetry in local languages. Some verses even ended up in the Guru Granth Sahib later.
And
vital. They wrote long poems, masnavis, using themes of human love as a metaphor for divine love. And music sessions, sama or qawwali, were central, incorporating local musical styles. Amir Khusrau, Nizamuddin Aulia's famous disciple, is credited with introducing the opening hymn in qawwali, blending Arabic, Persian, and Hindavi.
They sound incredibly skilled at cultural integration. which makes me wonder about their relationship with the state. Was it always smooth sailing?
Not always smooth, no, though often mutually beneficial. Rulers definitely wanted the support, the legitimacy that Sufis could offer.
Why them specifically?
Because Sufi authority was seen as coming directly from God. That was super useful for rulers, especially governing diverse populations where strictly applying the Sharia was tricky. Kings even wanted to be buried near Sufi shrines.
So Sufis offered a kind of spiritual validation.
Precisely. Something the more legalistic ulama couldn't always provide in the same way. But there were tensions.
Like what?
Things like court rituals should the sheikh prostrate, kiss the ruler's feet. That caused friction. Sometimes disciples gave their sheikhs really grand titles, like Sultan al-Mashaykh, Sultan among sheikhs for Nizamuddin Awliya. That could sound like a challenge to the actual sultan.
And did some Sufis try to keep their distance from power?
Yes. Source 9 gives a great example. Both Sheikh Nizamuddin Awliya and Sheikh Fariduddin famously refused gifts of land from rulers. They said their own masters hadn't accepted such things. So some Chishtis consciously chose to stay clear of state wealth and potential entanglement. Other Sufi orders were different. They did accept court positions and grants.
But still, you have symbols like Sheikh Salim Chishti's tomb built right inside Akbar's capital at Fatehpur Sikri. That speaks volumes about the bond.
It's a powerful visual, isn't it? Testament to that complex, often very close relationship.
Okay, let's shift focus a bit to North India. Two figures who just perfectly embody this era's dialogue, dissent, synthesis, Kabir and Baba Guru Nanak. Let's start with Kabir.
Kabir, 14th, 15th century maybe. Just one of those iconic poet saints, really bridging different worlds. But historians have a tough job reconstructing his actual life.
Why is that?
Because his verses come down through different traditions, all compiled much later. You have the Kabir Bijak, the Kabir Granthavali, parts in the Sikh scripture, the Guru Granth Sahib, plus later biographies, hagiographies, which show how followers saw him but might not be, historically precise.
Separating the man from the legend is hard.
Very. But his poetic voice, unmistakable. His poems use various languages, dialects, including Sant Bhasha, this kind of common language for poets, talking about the formless divine, nirguna, and Ulat Bansi, these upside-down sayings.
Upside-down sayings.
Yeah, using paradox to hint at mystical experience, like the lotus which blooms without flower, things that make you stop and think.
And his ideas pull from everywhere, Hindu, Muslim, yogic traditions.
Yes, that's what's so radical. He blends them, uses terms like Allah, Khuda, Pir from Islam, right alongside Brahman, Atman, Nirakar from Vedanta, and concepts like Shunya from Yoga. Source 10 is perfect.
What does it say?
He argues for the one Lord, present everywhere, just called by different names: Allah, Ram, Kareem, Keshav, Hari, Hazrat. He compares it to gold. You can call it different things depending on the ornament, but it's still gold.
And he doesn't hold back criticizing rituals and divisions, does he?
Not at all. Fearless. In that same poem, Source 10, he slams both Muslim goat sacrifice and Hindu reverence for cows, says people waste time arguing and miss the point. Some poems attack idol worship using Islamic ideas. Others use Sufi concepts like zikr, remembrance, or ishku, love, to talk about Hindu devotion.
So his work contains diverse, maybe even conflicting ideas.
It does, which leads to debates about which poems are genuinely his. But whatever the outcome of those debates, Kabir remains this incredibly inspiring figure for anyone questioning institutions, questioning divisions.
And he's claimed by different groups.
Exactly. Muslims, Hindus, especially Vaishnava Sikhs, they all claim him. That itself shows his huge, unifying, yet challenging impact. Vaishnava stories, for example, often say he was born Hindu but raised by Muslim weavers, maybe initiated by Ramananda, though historians debate the details of that connection.
Okay. Now let's turn to Baba Guru Nanak.
Baba Guru Nanak lived 1469 to 1539 up in the Punjab, came from a Hindu merchant family, worked as an accountant, learned Persian. But the sources show he spent a lot of time searching, traveling, meeting Sufis, meeting Bhaktas.
What was the core of his message?
His hymns, his teachings, they really centered on Nirguna Bhakti, devotion to one single, abstract, formless divine. He called it Rab, no gender, no form.
And he rejected external practices.
Very explicitly. Things he saw in both Hindu and Muslim traditions. Sacrifices, ritual bathing, worshipping images, extreme austerities, just reading scriptures without inner understanding. He rejected all that.
So if not through those external things, how did he suggest connecting with the divine?
Through a simple, direct path, remembering and repeating the divine name. And he expressed this through these beautiful hymns, shabads, sung in Punjabi. Often his attendant, Mardana, would accompany him on the rabab, a stringed instrument.
And he built a community, too.
Yes, he organized his followers into a sangat, a community for collective worship, reciting the name together. And crucially, before he died, he appointed a successor, Angad, establishing a lineage of gurus.
Did he intend to start a whole new religion?
The sources suggest maybe not initially, but his followers, guided by the later gurus, they did consolidate their practices, their scriptures, their community. Over time, they definitely distinguished themselves from Hindu and Muslim identities.
And his hymns formed the core of their scripture.
Absolutely. The fifth guru, Guru Arjan, compiled Baba Guru Nanak's hymns, those of the gurus who followed him, and also poems from other saints like Baba Farid, Ravidas, even Kabir, into the Adi Granth Sahib,
which became the Guru Granth Sahib.
Later, yes. The 10th guru, Guru Gobind Singh, added the hymns of the 9th guru and his own, finalizing the Guru Granth Sahib, which Sikhs revere as the eternal guru. Guru Gobind Singh also established the Khalsa Panth, giving the community distinct symbols, fostering a strong identity, socio-religious, and sometimes military when needed.
So in both Kabir and Baba Guru Nanak, we see these figures deeply immersed in the religious mix of their time.
Totally.
But offering radical critiques and new direct paths, bypassing a lot of the established stuff.
They're really powerful examples of the creativity, the synthesis, and, the challenging spirit of that whole era.
It's incredible how much complexity there is. As historians, how do they even piece this all together? What kinds of sources are they working with?
Well, as we've kind of touched on, they use a whole range of things: physical evidence, sculpture, architecture, stories about saints' hagiographies, tazkiras. Now, these might not be literal history,
but they show how people saw the saints.
Exactly, how devotees perceived them, their power. Then the devotional compositions themselves are absolutely key. The hymns, the sayings, in all these different languages, Tamil, Kannada, Hindavi, Punjabi, they offer direct insight into beliefs, emotions.
What else?
Letters from Sufi masters, maktubat, give glimpses into their thoughts, their disciples' lives. Biographies of saints, tazkiras, again, might be a bit fantastical sometimes, but they help trace lineages, how traditions developed.
Sounds like you need a diverse skill set.
You really do. Languages, understanding different literary styles, architectural styles, being sensitive to the historical context. And a big challenge, the sources point this out, is studying these traditions as historical things that change. Because often, for believers, they're lived truths, seen as timeless. But historians have to see the movement, the adaptation, the evolution over this long period.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
We have really covered a lot of ground here. 1,000 years of intense spiritual, social transformation in India. We've seen local beliefs mixing with bigger systems, devotion challenging social rules, new traditions like Islam and Sufism getting woven into the fabric.
And political power constantly interacting with religious authority, with popular belief.
It's a period that just vividly shows that humans search for meaning, for connection, manifesting in such diverse ways.
Sometimes blending, sometimes clashing, but always evolving. These weren't just dusty historical facts, they were living traditions shaping the subcontinent, and they still resonate.
Okay, so here's something to maybe mull over. Think about the world around you right now. How do deeply held beliefs, maybe expressions of faith, how do they interact with local culture, with social structures, class, community, with political power even?
Can you see echoes of these dynamics we've talked about, moments of mixing, challenge, negotiation, playing out today?
History isn't just about the past, right?
It gives us a lens, a way to understand the forces shaping things right now.
A powerful thought to leave you with. Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive into the Bhakti Sufi traditions.
Thanks for listening.
Keep exploring, keep questioning.